Matthew Frieman, PhD, has run a coronavirus lab at the University of Maryland School of Medicine for 13 years and has worked with coronavirus for the past 17 years. His research goal is to create therapeutic intervention for viruses of public health concern by developing a detailed understanding of how viruses interact with the host. His research is focused on the recently emerged and highly pathogenic coronaviruses, SARS, MERS, and SARS-2, which we all know as COVID-19. He deals with repurposed drugs and other therapeutics in dealing with these. Critical to his research is the synergy of in vitro and in vivo models of the disease that allow deep understandings of how these viruses work. Dr. Frieman will explain how his lab deals with health disparities and inequities in addition to his daily work. And as a reminder, we'd like you to put all of your questions in the chat and they will be addressed when Dr. Frieman finishes his presentation.
First, thank you for having me. I think I'm really excited to be introduced to you, to the group. Many of you know I grew up in Baltimore, just to give you a background. I grew up in Owings Mills, and my family has been here for a long time. Usually everyone knows one of my aunts or my mom. So they're the Perlman sisters. There's 5 of them. So there's space from my Aunt Bunny, who was a nurse for a very long time at Sinai, is the oldest, all the way down to Mindy, who is the youngest. And so somebody went to school or knows one of them along the way. So, but I'm glad that Susan asked me to come and present. And I'm really excited to show you what we've been doing in the lab, but also really give you a little bit better feeling maybe about what COVID-19 is, where we are now in this pandemic, and where we're going in the future. I know there's going to be tons of questions. I want to give you some of the basics that we've been working on and kind of the way that we see this pandemic, which may be different than what everyone is seeing out in the public. And but I'm really happy to answer any questions along the way. So please don't be shy. I've been told that you won't be shy. So I expect lots of discussion as we go, or at the end. All right. So let's just start here. So I am at University of Maryland School of Medicine. So I did grow up in Owings Mills. I went to Wash U as an undergrad, and then I came back here to Baltimore as a grad student at Johns Hopkins before I went to North Carolina, where for my postdoc, where I started working on coronaviruses in 2004, right after SARS coronavirus 1 emerged. And then ever since then, we've been really working on coronavirus and coronaviruses, how they cause disease, how they replicate, and really what we can do to understand all of the things that they do to our body. And so early on, this was SARS coronavirus 1, which emerged in 2003 in China. The MERS coronavirus, which some of you may or may not have heard of, it's the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. It emerged in Saudi Arabia in 2012. And so we quickly used all the things that we know about SARS-1 and used them to understand MERS. And then now SARS coronavirus 2 is everyone is much more of an expert on coronaviruses now than they ever were before, and has been going through this pandemic. And just broadly speaking, what we do in the lab is we take these viruses, we try to understand how they replicate in cells in a petri dish, how they replicate in cells in an animal. We use mice as our model, how they replicate in humans now for SARS coronavirus 2. And then while we understand how all of those interactions happen from the virus and our bodies and our immune response, how we can develop drugs or identify drugs and antibodies and vaccines that work against these viruses. Before, it was kind of an esoteric subject because no one really cared about any of this, because there was not many cases of any of these viruses in the world before SARS-2. But now, obviously, with COVID-19 and SARS-2 causing the disease we now call COVID-19, all of this work has become much more important. And we really are, it's been really nice to be able to play a role in helping develop therapeutics for a bunch of this work that's out there. And so the lab really works on a whole host of things. Just to introduce you, we work on antibodies and vaccines. So we worked with AstraZeneca and Regeneron on their monoclonal antibodies, as well as Eli Lilly We worked with Novavax on their vaccine, which is approved in 36 countries, but not in the United States yet. Hopefully that will be soon. We've worked on it with a bunch of drug companies on various drugs over time, and have been really funded well for the Gates Foundation and through NIH and BARDA and DARPA to develop antiviral drugs, both novel drugs that we are working on in the lab and creating, but also looking at drugs that we already know of that are out there to so that we can understand what this is, how to take drugs that are already approved off the shelf and use them for COVID patients. And then ultimately, I'm really a basic science person, not a clinical translational person. And so we really want to understand at the very molecular level, so protein in your cells and the protein of the virus, how they interact, what that viral protein does to our cells, and how all of that interacts with replicating these viruses. And so it's a lot going on in the lab, but I'm going to show you kind of what we see, what I see in the lab and out in the world for COVID-19, kind of the status of the pandemic right now, and then what we should be working on and looking forward, both looking forward to, but also being aware of in the future. All right. So the interesting thing for me, just to tell you why I do what I do, is that there's been, over the last 60 years, there's been this emergence of zoonotic viruses. So these are viruses that have jumped from animals to people. And so most of you have heard, everyone's heard of Zika virus, which jumped from mosquitoes into humans. The recent pandemic was in 2015 in Brazil, with West Nile virus that goes from birds to humans, and with mosquitoes in the middle, that started in the 90s. You've heard of Ebola, which started in the 70s, and there was obviously a recent outbreak in the 21st century, a really incredibly large outbreak of Ebola in Africa. You may not have heard of Nipah and Hendra virus, but there are other viruses that went from bats to humans. And we have SARS-1, which emerged in China in 2003, and now SARS-2, which again emerged from a similar region, but in 2019. And so I find it really amazing that there are all of these viruses out there in the wild. Most of them are strictly animal viruses. They don't have a chance or even a possibility of jumping to people. Even if they did, they wouldn't cause disease. But every once in a while, you get the wrong animal and the wrong mutant of a virus in an animal near or connected with a human, and you get these jumps of virus that goes around. And the really big worry about all of these is that some of them may be highly transmissible and especially respiratory. And we've always been looking, since SARS emerged in 2003, we've been looking in animals to look for another virus that may be a coronavirus, maybe influenza or something else, that have the capabilities of causing a wild pandemic like we're having right now. And it just so happens that it turned out to be a coronavirus similar to the SARS that emerged in 2003, similar family. And so the big worry is kind of shown here. This is a model actually from 2011, where this guy in Northwestern, this guy, Professor Brockman, he modeled what would happen for a pandemic that started, in this case, it was in the southeastern United States, looking for a respiratory virus that went and could hit every airport in every major city around the world. And his model predicted that a respiratory virus that transmitted like the common cold could transmit around the world in 53 days and hit every major city. And lo and behold, this is all essentially an algorithm and math based on previous data. And what we saw for SARS-CoV-2 was exactly what he kind of predicted. So the early days of SARS-2 really started in late 2019. That's why we call it COVID-19. The first announcement was in December 31st of 2019. There was a website called ProMed, which lists all the emerging pathogens around the world, all these notices every day. And this is me tweeting out, basically saying it's unlikely SARS, but worth a follow, meaning this weird undiagnosed pneumonia cluster that had been found in China in Wuhan. And it turned out that basically all of the the day before New Year's and New Year's Day of 2019 into 2020, I spent home trying to translate Chinese news reports using Google Translate to figure out what they meant and if there was any more news about these viruses. And it turned out that is ultimately what turned into the pandemic that we're doing right now. And so as of, I think I updated these numbers yesterday, the day before, if you look at the total numbers around the world, we're upwards of almost 450 million cases and 6 million deaths, which is just a horrific number of cases and people have died from this virus. This is the curve that's showing from the US from early 2020 all the way till now, upwards of 79 or 80 million cases in the US with almost with a little over 960,000 deaths, so almost 1 million deaths coming up in the next couple months, I would imagine. You can see also that at the early days of this pandemic, we were watching this. So our lab and other coronavirus labs, as well as CDC, were paying attention to these early cases in early 2020, when we only had a couple dozen that were circulating in the US and more that were identified in China every day. And so at the time, Nancy Messonnier, who was the deputy director of the CDC, had basically a press call that we listened into, and she had this line which is remarkably prescient at the time, and has turned into reality, which she said, "I understand this whole situation may seem overwhelming, and disruption to everyday life may be severe." And it certainly has, as we all have known, what's happened over the last 2 years. This has certainly come to bear. Okay, so a little bit of background on what coronaviruses are before we keep going. So coronaviruses have been around for a long time. There's 4 seasonal coronaviruses. They have these numbered and lettered jargons, but they give us a common cold. So they come every winter. We get infected with them. We have a mild cold symptoms, a couple days of a runny nose, and then we might feel a little icky, but it's just it's just a cold. About 30% of all winter colds are caused by one of these 4 coronaviruses in that first row. And the other ones we worried about before are SARS coronavirus, or SARS coronavirus 1, MERS coronavirus, and now SARS coronavirus 2. All of these are highly pathogenic. The original SARS coronavirus is about 10% lethal, but only infected 8,000 people. MERS is around 35% lethal, but luckily not very transmissible. But it's still in the wild. It's endemic in camels all over the Middle East, and you get camel to human jump every couple of weeks now, where a new case will happen, and you get little clusters of cases that way. But now SARS coronavirus 3, as you all know, is turned into this massive pandemic that we're under now. The viruses look like this. We don't want to go into specifics, but on the right here is what it looks like under our electron micrograph. You can see these little projections or lollipops that stick out of the virus. So this is what we call the spike protein. You've probably heard it about all the vaccines. This is the part of the protein that our body sees the most of, and what all of the vaccines are directed to, because it's on the outside of the virus. And so all of the mRNA vaccines and the protein-based vaccines and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, all of them in some way are targeting the spike protein on the virus. And that's what this outside, in this one, this purple lollipop designates here. As I said, all 3 of these were these really strange unknown viruses. I will say that all of them, SARS, MERS, and SARS-2, weren't discovered by a lab, guy like me doing basic science. They were really all identified because a really aware doctor or physician at the time in one of these countries in Saudi Arabia or China recognized that they had a person in their clinic that looked like a weird respiratory symptom, and it was strange, and it wasn't like what they had seen before. And so all of those turned into these kind of regular these pandemic viruses that we know of now. So as I said, the really key part of this protein for a bunch of therapeutics and for all the vaccines is the spike protein. And so this is just a kind of the protein structure, what we look like here. This is just a deeper picture of what that lollipop looks like on the left. It's really covered in these sugars, which are the outside of a bunch of proteins on our cells and on viruses. And so you can imagine if you're, think of yourself in a winter coat covered in the sugars are the winter coat of the spike protein. Their antibodies that we're making to the spike protein has to get through all of this sugar on the outside. And it makes it hard, and it makes it important for us to understand how these vaccines are working, what parts of the protein they're targeting, and that gives us more information about how what the next generation of vaccines really look like and how we make them better and better in the future. Okay, so I know it looks like gobbledygook, but the picture on the top, this kind of swoopy diagram, is really showing all these new variants that you've, of course, heard about in the news over time. And so all of these variants are basically started with the original Washington or Wuhan strain that we know of that started in China. And as the virus replicates and it goes through people, it mutates a little bit every time. And the chances are that most of the time, those little mutations have no effect on the virus or disease. They sometimes are lethal. So that virus that has a lethal mutation in it just doesn't go anywhere because it's a transmit. But every once in a while, you get a mutation that makes the virus more fit and it replicates better, or it does its thing better. And all viruses want to do is make more copies of themselves and infect more people. That's really what viruses, the whole goal of a virus is. And so they find all different ways of doing this, from changing the spike protein to changing all the other genes in the virus, making you potentially more sick, and so you cough more, or less sick, so that you don't know you're infected, but you're transmitting the virus to people that around you. And so all of this really made it pretty difficult to stop this virus along the way. And so as the virus replicated more and more through people, you got these mutations that occurred. And these names here are just what we call them in the lab, but you know them as alpha, beta, you may have heard of gamma from Brazil, there's delta and Omicron. And so all of these Greek names that we gave to them all signify different variants that have occurred over the past 2 years as they spread through people. And again, this is the spike protein structure on the bottom here. You don't have to know what any of this means, but you can see that there's more of these, all of the red numbers here designate changes to the spike protein, mutations that have occurred over time. And it's these mutations that have affected our vaccine efficacy, antibodies that work, and eventually at the beginning made them much more transmissible from these mutations than they were before. And that's certainly why we've had to wear masks and distance and worry about being in close spaces with other people that potentially may be sick and we don't know it. And all of that is because of mutations in the spike protein and other parts of the virus, which make it more transmissible. They last longer in the air. They're in droplets longer, so we get infected. The infectious dose is less, so the amount of virus we get into our bodies can be less and we still get sick. And it's also made a whole mess and problem with the vaccine side of this, because the vaccines were directed against the very early virus without the mutations. But the one that we're seeing right now in the wild is this Omicron variant down here with all these mutations. And so we spent a lot of time over the past 2 years following these variants, identifying which vaccines work better, if the vaccines need to be changed and when we need to be boosted, and all these things between our lab and working with NIH and the US government and different vaccine companies to try to understand exactly what timing needs to happen and what changes have to happen in the future. Okay. And so I'll do a little bit focus on vaccine development here, because I think it's important kind of to know what the differences between these are. Everyone here, or most people here, hopefully have gotten Moderna and Pfizer. These are the mRNA vaccines. And so the way these vaccines work is they're basically a little soap bubble, essentially, with the gene inside of it, but just the RNA region of it. So that normally things go from DNA to RNA to protein. This is the DNA intermediate, or the RNA intermediate. So as soon as they get into your cells, they start making the spike protein that I just showed you all these pictures of, and that we want to make vaccines to, or antibodies to. And so Moderna and Pfizer were the first out of the gate at in trials, and they've showed to be remarkably effective at reducing virus titer and protecting us from being in the hospital and getting severe disease. There is some, I understand, and it's certainly reported, there's some trepidation about some of these of the mRNA vaccines, that they've not been used in people, at least approved in people before COVID-19. But in the upwards of hundreds of billions of people that have been given this vaccine so far, there's remarkably few side effects, and they're incredibly effective, upwards of 90% efficacy, and 100% about keeping the people out of the hospital and dying if you are up to date on your vaccinations. The second set that was approved was these adenovirus vectors. So Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca both had a adenovirus version of their vaccine. And so in this case, adenoviruses normally give us a common cold during the winter. They made it so the adenovirus couldn't cause disease and doesn't replicate. So it can get into a cell, doesn't make more virus. But what it does is it expresses the spike protein. So similar to what the mRNA vaccines were doing, by getting the RNA for spike protein into the cell, and the adenovirus ones, it's the same idea, but using basically an attenuated virus, so a really sick virus that can't make more copies of itself, but it makes more of the spike protein that is cloned into the genome of these adenos. The adenos are a single dose, while the Moderna and Pfizer's need multiple doses. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which has been approved in the US, AstraZeneca has not, is not as effective overtly in keeping people from getting sick, but it does have high protection rates, upwards of 95% of keeping people out of the hospital with severe disease. In the US right now, everyone who has gotten 2 doses of Moderna or Pfizer is recommended to get a booster dose. And Pfizer has now petitioned to give a 4th dose to 65 and older population. So hopefully that will be approved soon, and we can continue to boost the people over 65 so we keep their antibody titers higher. For Johnson & Johnson, everyone who had the J&J vaccine has been recommended to get one of the either Moderna or Pfizer as a booster, so that you can keep your antibody levels high and for much longer. The other 2 on this list, the last one is from Sinopharm or Sinovac. These are primarily produced in China. In this one, what they did was they took the SARS virus itself, made a lot of it in large facilities, and then they killed the virus. So it's basically looks like the virus, but it is now no longer infectious, and they use that as the vaccine. It's not very effective, but it's widely used around the world, but it's not incredibly effective against protecting yourself from COVID infections. But the third one on the list from Novavax is the one that we actually worked a lot on. It's, as I said, it's approved in 36 countries, but it is not in the US yet. It's waiting for the FDA to approve it. In this vaccine, what they do is just, they make the spike alone in the lab or in factories, just the protein. And it's a more traditional vaccine, like influenza and other vaccines where you're just getting a protein as your vaccine. It works incredibly well. It works as good as Moderna and Pfizer in clinical trials. And hopefully it will be approved very soon in the US so that people who may have some concerns about the mRNA vaccines or have not got vaccinated yet will be able to get the Novavax vaccine or potentially use as a booster for other vaccinations. If we look around the world at the doses, it's we're upwards of 4 billion doses around the world that have been administered, over 3 billion doses of that Sinovac vaccine, as I showed you in China. In the US, over 500 million doses have been given out of mostly Moderna and Pfizer. A small population of that has gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But these are not evenly distributed because around the world, there has been certainly limited vaccine distribution in countries through this thing called COVAX, which is an association where international group that was basically taking in vaccines from all of the major vaccine producers and helping distribute them to countries in need. It has not worked very well. Currently, the problem is actually not getting enough doses into COVAX, but the problem is distributing doses to countries. And because of disinformation and anti-vax kind of literature being spread around a lot of countries in the world, there have been less uptake than you would have really need to limit the spread of COVID in a lot of these other countries. And so if you look at the countries that have actually donated vaccines to COVAX, the US actually has donated a lot of cases, over 400 million doses of vaccine have gone from the US to COVAX, a lot from the EU as well. And other countries pitching in part of their dosings that they've been allotted and been provided by Moderna and Pfizer. But if distribution is really the hard part, and both in the US to some communities, as well as really countries around the world which really need them, where we're seeing large uptick of cases now. One of the other really kind of major effects of this pandemic, as all of you well know, is that there's been a huge effect on women and girls around the world. On the left-hand side here is data from this USC polling center, where they look to see for psychological distress in women, female students or female adults with and without kids, and males as well. And what we find is that there's been a very large uptick in psychological issues reported for women, especially mothers, who have kids and have dealt with the entire pandemic either by themselves or even just responsible for their family infrastructure in the United States. And so the psychological effects are certainly a big problem. This goes into with schools being closed and all the other issues that go along with this pandemic we've all lived through. Also on the right here is another polling from the Kaiser Foundation, where they found that a larger share of women have gone without public health services during the pandemic than men. And so again, we see a huge increase in lack of healthcare and just women responding to the pandemic when things were closed and not taking care of their own healthcare responses for a variety of reasons, from skipping preventative healthcare checks, medical treatments, prescriptions, and not getting appointments because offices were closed. And so all of this leads into this really dramatic effect on women and girls during the pandemic, which now recognizing these problems are there, there's increase in infrastructure now to try to correct this and for the short term, but also protect against it happening the next time we have a pandemic and the next time there is this downturn or change in social structure like we have now. The other aspect of this is not just in women, but also in minorities. There has been multiple reports of less vaccination and issues in minority households. If you look on the left-hand side here, this is looking at the employment differences based on minority population over the pandemic, and where there's a huge increase in lost employment for especially the minority population and parents during the last 2 years, which has been well reported and certainly recognized and is trying to be fixed now. This has also been seen around the world where children have been shut out of schools because of closures, as well as young people have been classified as this category that the UN calls not in education, employment, or training. So a huge deficit in people being kept out of businesses and employment as well as schools. So 2/3 of are young women versus men. So there's been this very large inequity that we've seen over the pandemic. Also, when you look at vaccination rates, this is just in the US now, at the minority population, you can see that the minorities, especially African Americans, shown here in the circles on the bottom, are much less likely to be vaccinated, even up till now, compared to the Caucasian and general population. And so there's a variety of reasons for this, from distrust of medical providers to not having vaccines available to them. And so all of this goes into this large push now by the government to really fix this inequity, to get vaccine and to get healthcare into populations and communities, even here in Baltimore, where they are not at the same accessible rate that I would have even here. The last little bit about this too is that there's been a huge political issue of inequity as well, both because of vaccine uptake for political reasons and political party, as well as belief in anti-science rhetoric and anti-vaccine rhetoric and distrust of the government. This has been also widely reported. This left one here is from the New York Times, and the right is from, I think it's from the CDC, showing that depending on where you voted in the last election, it certainly mattered in the amount of vaccine uptake you had. And you can see here on the right-hand side, the percentage of people that are fully vaccinated. There's a huge swath in the middle of the country and the Southeast where there are major political party swings. And you can see that certainly affects the vaccine uptake and frankly, belief in part of this pandemic as we've seen it. Okay. So if we go back to the therapeutics that we've kind of worked on and what are available, I already told you about all the vaccines and their efficacy, as we talked about. The other side of this, which I think I really want to emphasize, is the ability of these things called monoclonal antibodies. So these are basically just the antibody part of the vaccines that our body normally, the antibodies that our body usually generates by vaccination. And so these monoclonals, the first ones were from Regeneron, called Regencov. The company GSK and Vir have another one called Sotrovimab. AstraZeneca just released an antibody combination called Evishield, and Eli Lilly had 2 early ones, but now a new one called, we just call BEV in the lab. I won't pronounce it. And all of these are actually remarkable therapeutics. They have to be given early, after infection, but they are able to protect against severe disease and hospitalization and really reduce the amount of virus in someone's body, even up to 2 days after they've been infected. The crossed out ones here from Regeneron and these two from Eli Lilly are crossed out because as we've now got to Omicron, these antibodies recognize only a very small part of the spike protein, and they're no longer effective against Omicron. So the US government and FDA have pulled these vaccines from circulation, but there still are, sotrovimab and Evishield are still out there. BEV has been sent to the FDA now for approval. And so hopefully if you ever do get infected with SARS coronavirus 2 and you end up, these are all hospital, you have to be in the hospital to get these doses. You can request this, and not many people know about them, but it certainly is a remarkable therapeutic that we have that does work and is available if you ask. The other side of this are these new drugs that have been approved. So remdesivir was approved very early on. That is an injectable drug. It affects, it certainly does reduce the amount of virus in the body, but has to be injectable as an IV. Molnupiravir is the new one from Merck that has just been approved. It works similarly to what remdesivir does from Gilead. It affects the protein in the virus that makes copies of the genome called the polymerase. Molnupiravir is oral, so you can take it orally. There has been questions about molnupiravir and its potential ability to mutate DNA, and it's not used. It's used at kind of low levels now because of this worry about potential after effects. The new one that has just been approved is pavloxavid, which is from Pfizer. It is a protease inhibitor. So you may have heard of protease inhibitors for HIV. So it's from Pfizer. It's an oral drug, works remarkably well, upwards of 85 to 90% of reduction in virus titer and for people who have been infected. This Pfizer drug is one of the priority drugs that the Biden administration has been pushing for their test and treat program, where if you have a positive PCR test, you can go to the pharmacy and you can say, here's my test, and I want this Pfizer drug, and you can get it from the pharmacy now. So doses are becoming more and more available at places around the country. Again, it leads in this inequity problem where there isn't enough doses to go everywhere, but you can get it in Baltimore if you go to the pharmacy after having a positive test. And we now are working on additional drugs that are able to protect longer and better and faster than these current drugs. The real big push for all of these drugs is to make broad antivirals, so things that work against all of the coronavirus variants, as well as protecting against long COVID, so things that this phenotype where upwards of 30% of people who are infected with COVID-19 have symptoms that go on past 6 months after they've been infected. And so we're really worried and trying to understand what it is about this long COVID syndrome that has been studied in people. Okay, so show you that. So the way that these vaccines, the antibodies work, both the monoclonals and the vaccines, when we get vaccinated, is they make these antibodies that are shown here in these kind of purple Ys. So they stick to the outside of the virus. And you can see the spike proteins I showed you before, just shown differently here. They block the way that the virus gets into cells. And so they really do, it's remarkably effective. And vaccination is really our primary goal of our primary therapeutic that can be used to keep people out of the hospital from getting sick. The people who are vaccinated have a 6 times higher, or people who are unvaccinated have 6 times higher risk in adults of being hospitalized and having severe disease. And so you can see this one, the blue line is the rate of unvaccinated people that are per 100,000. Green is the rate of fully vaccinated people. And so we really want this unvaccinated rate to go down. And so we're still in the United States at around 100 out of 100,000 people in the country that are unvaccinated. We need that number to go lower so we can reduce the amount of virus that's out in the population. Okay, the last little bit is about Omicron, where we are now. And so Omicron, or the names that we use in the lab, are this BA1.1, B11529, and BA2. So all of these are in this Omicron lineage as we name them. Almost everything in the United States is now this Omicron variant. this really remarkable thing about this virus is that it's incredibly transmissible. It has this really mutagenized spike, as I showed you before, with all those red changes on them, which means that they can get around vaccines a bit more than the other variants could. But importantly, it does seem to cause less disease, even in unvaccinated people, but especially in vaccinated people. So I don't know how many of you have gotten infected recently or had symptoms, but it usually just causes mild cold symptoms if you are vaccinated and boosted. The people that show up in the hospital are still the unvaccinated. So no one who's vaccinated generally is showing up with severe symptoms, a very small minority of the population. But the good thing is that the current vaccines still protect against Omicron if you have been boosted. It keeps you out of the hospital and from getting severe disease. So the time is not yet to switch the vaccine to a new strain, but we're watching that closely to see what the next variant will tell us. And then there is a new one that is Deltacron, or they're all called different names. There's nothing to be worried about. They're basically recombinants of the Delta virus and the Omicron virus. They don't cause any more severe disease. There's certainly been reports of these things being found around the world, but has not shown up as any more worse or any more severe symptoms that we know of so far. Okay, so the last slide here is just what happens next, right? So will a new variant emerge? Certainly yes. The question is how severe it's going to be and do our vaccines work? And that's what we're working on now, is finding these variants before they really spread. Are we going to need booster shots in the future and yearly new doses of these vaccines? Certainly we will. Whether we'll need them every year or every couple of years is yet to be determined on how long the antibodies for these viruses to the vaccines last, and what the circulating variants are at the time, but we certainly will need boosters per year. We don't know where the next variant is going to come from, whether it's going to be from someplace in the United States or China or Africa or Europe. They've come from everywhere so far. We don't know where it's going to come from. There's the very strange thing, if anyone's been reading about this in the news lately, that the animals in the wild, especially deer, have been infected with COVID-19, and we are certainly following those viruses as they're spreading around the animal population to see if they jump back into people. And what should you feel like now? Can you feel safe outside? And with the numbers of cases that we have, at least especially in Baltimore and the Maryland area, it's certainly very safe to be inside areas with other people that you know that are vaccinated and are not sick. So I would say if you're fully vaccinated, then you can really reduce your fear of being around other people and in close contact. I do still wear a mask when we're around people that I don't know and are not vaccinated, or I don't know if they're vaccinated. And so I still wear when I go to the store. It's certainly easy enough to do. And the same is for restaurants. Personally, it's a personal choice of whether you feel comfortable going out of restaurants and eating without masks. But I would say it's maybe safe, depending on where you are in the country. If you're in a place where the cases are really low and you're fully vaccinated, then you can feel much safer about this. And the last thing is on long COVID. So the ability for us to really predict this long COVID symptoms is minimal right now. There's a whole wide spectrum of these neural issues that have been shown for in the population, and we'll be working on this for a long time to figure out what causes it and how to protect us in the future. Okay, sorry, I talked for a long time. I will end there, and happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. We really, so Dr. Frieman, we really appreciate it. There are lots of questions, so let's dig in. The very first question came from a member, and they would like to know, if not addressed, what is a repurposed drug?
Oh, sure. So a repurposed drug are things that are already approved by the FDA. So things that are on the shelf, you can go get a prescription for, and then use them, looking for things that protect us against COVID. There are some of them that work really well. Other ones that don't, like ivermectin, has been in the news, doesn't do anything. But other ones that we are trying to identify that are able to actually be really strong drugs that work against us. So the new ones like molnupiravir and Paxlovid are new FDA-approved ones, and we still are searching for other ones that may work better, especially in combination too.
Thank you. Can vaccines be made to attack a sugar coating on the proteins so that vaccines are more effective?
No, great question. So the sugar part of that thing I find really remarkable, and so that's used by the virus, and a lot of viruses do the same kind of strategy to make it so that antibodies can't bind. And when the good thing is that for the mRNA vaccine or the protein-based vaccines or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, when they're made inside cells, they're made with the sugar coating on the protein. So your body is seeing what it normally would see with the spike and the sugars on it. So that's what the antibodies are recognizing. And if you remember one of those pictures I showed with all the sugars on it, there was some bald spots. And so those bald spots are the key parts where we really can get good antibodies there to target them and to block. And what the virus has been showing us over time is that as it makes mutations, it throws up new sugars here and there. So where we have good antibodies that are blocking these regions, and now it'll put a sugar in that region, so now the antibody can't bind anymore. And so there's this little gaming system that goes back and forth between the virus fighting us and us fighting the virus. So it's an intriguing part of all the science.
Interesting. Why didn't the names of the variations go serially through the Greek alphabet?
Oh, so we skipped, we skipped new because they didn't want it to be like the new virus, supposedly. And they skipped XI, because it's the name of the president of China, supposedly. I don't know why. That's what I've heard. Yeah.
Okay.
But there are other ones in the middle. So even though we haven't, like, in the news, you don't hear about mu or gamma. Those are variants of concern that we have in the lab we've worked on and are named. They're just not hugely dramatically transmissible. And so they're not things that are kind of generally in the popular press.
I see. Can you address vaccines for children under 5? Tell us where we are.
Yeah, great question. So we do have 5 to 11-year-olds that have been approved, which is great. I suspect a booster from them, just as an aside, booster for 5 to 11-year-olds at some point in the future. Those trials are ongoing. The trials on the under 5s, 6 month to 5-year-olds, when they read out earlier in the year, they did not report that they were getting to the same level of antibody as we saw in in adults or even teens. And so that was the problem with the trials. And so they are now going in with a 3rd dose and with increasing doses of vaccine in little kids. And trust me, I want that out there. And so that parents who have little kids can feel comfortable. I know we have many friends who have little kids who are basically like, I don't care if no one's wearing a mask. We're acting the same because, my 3-year-old isn't vaccinated yet. I certainly hope to get there soon. And these things the trials are ongoing now. That's all I can say. I don't have any good timing on when they're going to be done. A lot of them are actually here at University of Maryland too, at the Center for Vaccine Development, right down the hall.
Interesting. Bloomberg published an article stating cities monitor COVID through sewer water. Can you explain?
Yeah, so so people have looked in sewer runoff for polio for years. One of the really remarkable things that has been found over this pandemic is people started looking in sewer water to see if they could see any SARS coronavirus 2 RNA. So you look for the virus basically in the runoff, and you could find it. And so the interesting thing is it predates by about a week the cases as they surge in the cities. And so this is ongoing now. It's now being funded in a large part by the US government. The CDC is now cooperating with a bunch of health services around the country to monitor runoff and looking for basically viral RNA that's shed through the gut in our toilets rather than out of our nose and mouth. And I don't know if anyone here has had COVID over the last 2 years, but a lot of people report having gut issues. And so while we think of it as respiratory virus, there certainly is some component of it getting and infecting the guts of certain people. And you can see that in the sewer water runoff samplings, which is a really early way of detecting new surges that are coming. And I would say that just this week, there's been a bit of a blip for this BA2, the stealth Omicron, that's starting to spread. And so in certain cities around the country, you can see a little bit of a rise in the sewer runoff, which is what people are really worried about, this next potential surge that might be coming with the new variant.
The next question is the vaccine made from fetal tissue?
So the mRNA and the Pfizer vaccines are not made from fetal tissue. The only issue with fetal tissue that could come up with these vaccines is that the cells that we grow virus in to do studies are have been from we use monkey cells, we do use human cells from the lungs and from the liver. They're the cells that there's HeLa cells that grow from Henry Lambert that was a long story if anyone read the book about her from Hopkins. They are from people, and there are cell lines made from aborted fetal cells. These are no new cells have been used. These are cells that have been produced from cell lines from about 50 years ago. And so none of the Novavax one is made of insect cells. The Moderna and Pfizer are synthetic, so they are not made in cells at all. The Johnson & Johnson is used in cells, but these are the cell line that they use to make their virus has been around for 50 years or so. And so they're nothing is newly created to use these viruses.
Interesting. Do you think there will be a time where we can check our individual antibody levels to see if we need boosters?
This is a great question. I really hope so. I know that you can go to the doctor and you can get an antibody read and you get a positive or negative. The really broader question there, which I think it goes to that point, is that we don't know yet how much antibody you need to keep you from being infected and getting sick. It seems like a simple question, and I want the answer too. What we see so far is that as the variants have gone over time, you need more and more virus to protect yourself from those new variants because they become more immunoevasive. So there's essentially, you can think of it as less parts on the spike protein that those antibodies can see and recognize. And so you need more of those antibodies there to protect you from getting infected with that virus. Sometimes it's also because those variants are more infectious. So you have the infectious dose is less. So you need less virus in your nose to actually cause an infection now versus what you did in early 2020. But to the point of the question, it's hard to quantify these things in a mass scale that someone can do in their house, like we do for antigen testing or by PCR testing. And so it'll be a while. I don't see there a consumer version of this anytime soon, but I hope to know, at some level how much you really need. And that part of it is the hard part about quantifying these antibodies and knowing what's really needed for protection.
Thank you. Is there a shortage of monoclonal therapeutics?
So for the monoclonals, so early on there was a shortage where the Regeneron and the early AstraZeneca or the early Eli Lilly antibodies were in very short supply. There were only a couple 100,000 doses around the country, very little around the world. Even still, there's very little around the world. It's mostly, the US gets a lot of these doses and Europe. Currently now, no one takes them. So there are doses out there if you want them. There really are not many people getting them. And so I highly recommend them, especially if you are immunocompromised in any way. So that maybe you've been boosted 3 times and you're on immunosuppressive drugs for all kinds of things, IBD or any other kind of rheumatoid arthritis, something like that. These antibodies last about 6 months. They protect you very similar to what a vaccine would do. And both the Eli Lilly and the AstraZeneca antibodies work really well, especially against Omicron as well. And so those doses are there if anyone wants to get them. But they are, the new Eli Lilly one, this BEB antibody is coming out. It's not yet FDA approved, but it should be soon.
Thank you. Your presentation doesn't mention the Omicron B2 variant. Do you anticipate a spike in cases due to this variant and or any other potentially unknown variant in the future?
I got there in the end. I don't know when that question was asked. But the B2 was at the end. So that's this BA2 that the stealth Omicron we're worried about now. Will there be a spike? I don't know. We're not over this pandemic. These variants are still out there. I think we will see a spike. And every day more people are vaccinated. Every day more people are boosted. The good thing so far about BA2 is that it seems to be less lethal. I'm not going to say mild because I don't think people are still showing up in the hospital with BA2 infections that are severe. But generally, if you are vaccinated, It's not as severe as the previous versions of this virus was. And so I think that's a good thing as we get into this. I certainly think that now that everyone, the CDC has said you don't need masks and people are out and about, unmasking is going up as well as the BA2 cases. And I think we will see probably an early summer bump in cases. I'd be surprised if it looks anywhere like BA1, like the first Omicron virus looked like, with this massive surge around the country. Most of the data so far says that if you were infected with BA1, the first Omicron strain, you should be protected if you get exposed to BA2, especially if you're vaccinated. Then you get a bump in titer because you're recently infected. So all that together suggests that we won't get a really big surge, but there's a lot of people out there who are still not seroconverted. They don't have antibodies, they're not vaccinated, they haven't been infected, and they are highly susceptible to this new variant that's coming.
Thank you. Do you see vaccinations being wrapped into the standard flu vaccine?
So that's another great question. I don't know if it'll be the same dosing. It certainly could be the same time. Several companies are doing combination tests now to give both flu as well as their COVID vaccine together in one shot to see if there's less protection or less antibodies against either of them if you give them separately. So I know Novavax is, because we work with them. They're doing a flu. They have a flu vaccine that got FDA approved last year. So the flu and their SARS vaccine are together in one shot. They're testing now for trials. But many other companies are doing this combinations. One of the questions that's coming up is that for flu vaccine, you have to change it every year. And so it'll be harder to formulate them together easily because of the timing and the changing that occurs. So I think they'll probably be given separate, but hopefully recommended at the same time. So you only have to, you bring yourself or your kids to the doctor once and you get both shots together. And as long as they're both effective when given together, which they should be, then it should be a way to do this simply.
Thank you. We were all told that, we should get booster shots after around the 6-month mark. Is there any more information about how long the shot, the booster lasts and when it becomes ineffective?
So the data shows that, so the reason the 6-month mark is because after you get, and it happens with every vaccine, this isn't different for COVID, but once you get vaccinated, you get the first dose gives you a little bit of antibody. The second dose really gives you a heightened antibody response. So that's your kind of starting dose of your previously fully vaccinated. And over time, the antibody that's in your body goes down. It's called waning immunity. It happens for every vaccination. It's not unusual. The concern is that you get to a low enough level that as these new variants are coming, having this low level doesn't protect you anymore from that initial infection. Once you get infected, you get a recall response. You get a bump in your antibody levels. It's just how the immune response works. But if it doesn't happen soon enough after infection, or your starting baseline antibodies are too low, then your infection can cause more disease. And so if you get boosted as a third dose, you bring your antibodies basically back up. And so now we're going down again. And so into this now 6-month range where people got boosters and now they're coming back down to that lower level. The good thing is that lower level is higher than after 2 doses. And so now our starting point is a bit better than we were before after the third dose, 6 months after the third dose versus 6 months after the second dose. If that makes any sense. And so we will certainly need boosters in the future to bring us back up, especially if the current vaccines are shown to be less protective against a new variant that's coming out. But when that'll be for the new boosters, I don't know. But as I said, the Pfizer has requested, the FDA approved a 4th dose for 65 and over, so you can bring up that level of antibody. What we do know is people with comorbidities like diabetes and obesity, being over 65, lessens that amount of antibody in response to any vaccine, including the COVID vaccines. And so you really need an extra dose to get you up there to keep you safe and healthy, and not being able to be sick. So after infected. So that's kind of where this all comes from. And I think that we will need boosters again soon. And hopefully, more of the population will get the first booster, let alone the second booster as we get there.
Thank you. And actually, as an add-on to the booster question, there was some information that said that getting boosted too frequently in 1 year may actually reduce the effectiveness of fighting the virus. Is that? Tell us about that.
You guys are a good group. Yeah, so this is data out of Israel. So Israel has already gone to the 4th doses, and they've had doses that their boosters have been much shorter timing than what we've had in the US. And so what they've been able to see is that basically you get diminishing returns as you keep dosing more and more in this shorter time frame. And so it's actually good to have a bit of a spacing. So your immune response needs some time to respond to your vaccinations. The first and second dose being 3 or 4 weeks apart is okay. That was a decision that was made based on the trial data. The additional boosters being really close to the end doesn't give you a lot of time for your immune response, something called it matures, or affinity maturation. So that basically the antibodies that you have in your cells, they can start mutating a bit. And the idea is that they mutate to protect you from changes in that next thing you see. So they actually, again, it's the virus fighting against us and us fighting against the virus. It's kind of yin and yang. And so having those boosters too close minimizes that maturation time that our body, our antibody producing cells respond to. And so being too close is bad. The dosing schedule that we have now with the 6 months in of a booster and then maybe another 6 or 12 months for another booster is substantial, and it's enough time for this maturation process to happen. But too close is really not good. We've seen for not just for COVID, but for a lot of vaccines.
Thank you. Let's see, is the current virus more or less dangerous for the under 5-year-old population, the unvaccinated ones?
So kids generally, so this is also this balance that goes to this idea of like, what does the trial show for the vaccine for the 6-month to 5-year-old kids? We're being very cautious about what we give to little kids because the vast majority of them don't get severely ill. Some of them have got severely ill, which is incredibly terrible, but most of them don't get severely ill from COVID infections. And so you have to balance the potential downside of the vaccines with what is the upside of protection and infections. And so little kids have not shown severe disease from Omicron in general. They get runny nose and they become snotty and get a cold symptoms like they would from a seasonal cold, but not much severe disease that at least we've been identifying in other populations that have been unvaccinated.
Thank you. Can your research help find a vaccine for HIV?
We're not working on the HIV side, but I will say that the mRNA technology is certainly being used for HIV now. I think actually the NIH just announced a trial for mRNA vaccines being used for HIV protection. And so basically all of the things that have been learned about these vaccines, especially at the RNA side, are going to be used for a lot of other diseases, from malaria, dengue, to HIV and CMV, and a lot of other viruses. So the HIV work based on the mRNA technology from Moderna is ongoing now, and they have trials for vaccines for HIV that just started. So I would say stay tuned, and if they work as well as they do for COVID, which I certainly can't promise they work that well for HIV, but it's certainly a good chance of it in the future that we learn a lot about these viruses and protection them from the technology that has been developed for COVID.
Thank you. Just 2 more questions. One, we had heard earlier on that dogs and cats can actually get COVID. Is there any kind of vaccine in development?
So I don't know who asked that question, but I love it. I was freaking out the beginning of 2020 when I saw the first data that cats could be infected with SARS-2, and the data is remarkable. Just 10 seconds, I promise. Because cats, when in the lab, there are people we don't work on cats or dogs, just mice. But the labs that do work on cats and dogs, when they infect them with the virus, the dogs get minimally infected, not a lot actually. Cats can have crazy amount of virus in them, and it's all and they shed it in their poop. And you can find live virus, a lot of viral RNA in cats, much higher than a lot of other animals and even humans. In very few cases, if in the, maybe under 5 cases around the world of people whose companion animals, dogs and cats, are positive, and then they have transmitted to the humans in the house. I don't understand how that works. We don't really know why they're not transmitted that way. So I'm not, there certainly are, this company called Zeodis, I believe, is the one that they do a lot of veterinary vaccines. They have a COVID vaccine. I don't believe it's been widely used in companion animals at all. But it is, I still don't know why cats don't spread to humans. I was very worried at the beginning of this when the data came out, but they don't. It doesn't mean that in the future a variant can't gain that capability and replicate differently in cats and transmit, but right now it's certainly not a big problem, and I don't think it's a worry. It's a problem for vaccination for those kind of animals yet.
Thank you. And the last question I have is, how would you relate SARS-CoV-2 to the flu of 1918?
So there's a lot to that question. I would say that the first thing that comes to mind is that if anyone has read this, a bunch of books, The Great Influenza, Great Pandemic, that was written about 1918 flu. One of the remarkable things is that the major public health intervention was wearing masks and distancing, which is, we didn't learn that much beginning of where we are now to then. But there's also a remarkable level of distrust of the government and public health officials in 1918 and 1919 compared to what we have now. I mean, it's similar to what we have during 2020 and 2021. And so from a public health perspective, I still don't, I just, in my brain, I can't understand this remarkable anti-science angle to a lot of the, where we are in the population right now. But it's very common, and it's been from the early 1900s all the way till now. So that's certainly one thing that's very common between the two. I think that the remarkable difference is that we did not have dramatic therapeutic interventions then that were rapidly produced. The mRNA vaccines that came out, they're not magic, but they are incredibly effective. And we have a therapeutic that can work now, which is different than we had then. Most people that died in 1918 from the 1918 flu did not even die from the flu. They died from secondary bacterial infections afterward. That is not what we're seeing for COVID. And because we have a lot of antibiotic treatments that are given essentially right away when you go to the hospital with severe disease, the secondary infection rate is very, very low for anyone affected and has COVID-19. So that part of it is a dramatic difference. But public health-wise, really bizarre similarities in the response from the government, public health officials, as well as the public, that I think we'll be worrying about and dealing with for a long time because of all of the generated distrust for whatever reason in the public health infrastructure.
Thank you. And then I didn't put this in the chat, but I'm very curious. At the very beginning of all this, back in December of 2019, when you tweeted that first thing, you didn't think it was SARS. How did you feel? Was it one of those, oh wow, or
At
just
the time,
curious?
when I learned about it then, or
Yeah,
afterwards?
yeah.
So being in the coronavirus field for this long, there's always these strange reports of pneumonias and certain things that are popping up over time. And only twice have they turned out to be something. One was MERS and now SARS-2. So the majority of the time, it's totally something related. It's flu or it's some other bacterial pneumonia that was just, strange occurrence. It's been very strange to be a coronavirus researcher in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic. We still have a lot of work to do, but I'm certainly glad at the work we've done and proud of the things that the lab's been able to help with in companies and getting these things out into people's arms. I'm not, as I said, I'm not a translational scientist. I'm a very basic science guy. Microscopes and cells in a petri dish was my life. And the fact that we can do some things in the lab that actually get into humans, I find to be completely remarkable, but I'm glad that we were really in a position to help. And so that's the reason that the lab works so hard every day now, is still to figure things out that are new and to test all these antibodies and vaccines and drugs to be able to help people while we figure out what they do in the lab.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Frieman. This was so enlightening and really interesting. Just a couple of things, so thank you very much for joining us. And I wanted to mention that I'm just so intrigued and excited that you've chosen to donate your honorarium for today to Doctors Without Borders in Ukraine. I think that's really amazing. So thank you so much for doing that. And also a couple of quick updates. Also, first, a thank you once again to Dr. Frieman, and also to Jeff Davis, our tech consultant from Izagamuno. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And just a couple of things coming in April. We have our next education meeting on April 14th, where we will continue our discussions about health disparity and inequity. And then Thursday evening, April 21st at 7 p.m. we will have our spring Circle Reads, and Circle Reads will be discussing the book Black Man in a White Coat, A Doctor's Journey and Understanding of Race in Medicine. So please join us for that, or at least keep an eye out for your e-invitations. Thank you to my co-chair, Susan Manigan, and to Martha Sukor and Susan Pearl for your amazing leadership, and have a wonderful day.